Hamilton had a torrid affair, and he wrote it down right there. Highlight!
Welcome to History Sleep, a podcast exploring the involvement of history and culture in current events. My name is Adelaide, and today we're going to talk about the Reynolds Pamphlet, which is the story that Hamilton told about his relationship with Maria Reynolds and the money he paid to her husband to maintain that relationship. But before we get into that, if you're on Twitter, follow me at Sleep History to get updates about when I post new episodes, and make sure also to follow History Sleep on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, I wanted to kind of mention, I just find it kind of crazy that I've already gotten to 30 episodes of this podcast and almost 700 downloads now. So I wanted to take a second and just thank all of you who have been listening and supporting me. This has been a really great space for me to explore and express things that interest me, things that anger me, and just correct misinformation and dangerous historical narratives. So a podcast isn't much of anything without its listeners. So thank you guys for coming along with me on this sleuthing journey. Okay, now let's get into today's topic. This might be a long one, and I'm also tired, so I might be long-winded, but it'll be fun. It'll be fine. Okay, we are going to focus first on the song from the musical Hamilton that tells this story. So I'm going to play that and kind of talk in between. And there's a bit of a tension here because obviously the musical written by Lin-Manuel Miranda about the life of Alexander Hamilton is meant to be entertainment, but it's based on real people and real events. And so in some ways it does reflect what actually happened or inform or educate people on what actually happened. Kind of, but we also have this understanding that it's for entertainment. So there's this weird tension here, right? And not everyone watches the musical Hamilton, which it's on Disney Plus, by the way, if you haven't been able to see it, and you can listen to the music on Spotify and whatnot after you listen to this podcast episode. But not everyone listens to the musical or watches the musical and then is like, okay, I'm going to research and find out what parts of this are true, what parts of this aren't true, what's kind of creative interpretation. And there are some areas where creative interpretation is a good thing and it's awesome and interesting and helps people engage in history in a new way. And then there's other times where creative interpretation leads to misunderstandings about certain aspects of our history, especially American history. People have a lot of opinions about what American history should be. That's kind of what I run into a lot on this podcast, is correcting narratives that people have created because of the view that they want to have of American history rather than the view that actually happened. But this is all a tangent. It's not even in my notes. I'm only 3 minutes in, already getting off on other topics. But I wanted to focus specifically on Maria Reynolds' story today. And the reason why I wanted to investigate more into her narrative, the narrative that Hamilton created about their interaction, is because I was listening through the Hamilton album and I realized that the way the song called Say No to This portrays Maria Reynolds is a rather cliche portrayal of women in general, like a seductress or a temptress or something. And she plays way more into that caricature of this over-sexualized woman rather than a real person. And so I thought that was interesting that she was so cliche because I feel like Lin-Manuel Miranda is a pretty good writer and wouldn't fall into a cliche as obvious himself. And so I wondered if there was something more going on there from his source material, from the actual Reynolds pamphlet. And so when I listened to the song again, I was trying to frame the story from Maria Reynolds' perspective with the information given. And looking at it that way, her choices don't seem consistent or logical in a way, which indicates to me that someone isn't telling the truth here. So we're going to listen to parts of the song and then read parts of the Reynolds pamphlet and some other sources. Also, I don't know if you've noticed yet in this first couple minutes, but for some reason the word pamphlet is really hard for me to say. All right, it's not hard, but I have to think about it. I look at it and I want to say pamphlet, but it's PH, so it's pamphlet. The English language is horrible. Okay. Sorry. Moving on. Let's listen to the song Say No to This.
There's nothing like summer in the city. Someone under stress meets someone looking pretty. There's trouble in the air, you can smell it. And Alexander's by himself. I'll let him tell it.
I hadn't slept in a week, I was weak, I was awake. You've never seen a bastard orphan more in need of a break. Longing for Angelica, missing my wife. That's when Miss Maria Reynolds walked into my life, she said.
Okay, Important note right here, right at the beginning. This is Hamilton's story from Hamilton's perspective. Throughout the musical, Burr kind of works as a narrator, or he brings us from song to song, kind of intros, different things, different characters, tells us what's going on. But immediately after this first verse, he hands the mic over to Alexander Hamilton and says he's going to tell the story. This is his story. And so I think that's an important part to remember. This is not Maria Reynolds' story from her perspective, even though she is given a voice and there's an actress singing lines that are ascribed to her character. This is still a story told from Hamilton's perspective, which I think is kind of hard. It's easier when reading the Reynolds pamphlet that Hamilton actually wrote, because you're like, well, Hamilton wrote this, so obviously this is all his perspective. But it's harder when that pamphlet is put on stage, which is basically what this is. So this is still Hamilton's point of view and understanding of the situation. So in the musical too, it makes it difficult because this song, we find out the events of the Reynolds pamphlet and Hamilton's and Maria Reynolds' relationship before the other characters. We find out before the other characters, but in real life, this real situation, everyone found out through the Reynolds pamphlet, which Hamilton wrote to defend himself from criticism about being involved in speculation, which is some kind of like financial scandal, I think. So if there are inconsistencies in this story and in the way that Maria Reynolds is portrayed, that's because of the way that Hamilton described her and the way Lin-Manuel Miranda and historians and biographers of Hamilton have interpreted his words and his portrayal of her. So let us continue.
Longing for Angelica, missing my wife. That's when Miss Maria Reynolds walked into my life. She said,
I know you are a man of honor. I'm so sorry to bother you at home, but I don't know where to go, and I came here all alone.
She said,
my husband's doing me wrong, beating me, cheating me, mistreating me. Suddenly he's up and gone. I don't have the means to go on.
So I offered her a loan. I offered to walk her home. She said,
you're too kind, sir.
I gave her $30 that I had socked away. She lived a block away. She said,
this one's mine, sir.
Then I said, well, I should head back home. She turned red. She led me to a bed, let her legs spread and said,
stay.
Hey.
Hey.
Okay, so here's the stuff that starts to not make sense. We are given the facts of the situation from Maria Reynolds as portrayed by Jasmine Cephas Jones. Her voice is absolutely beautiful. I love it. But anyway, that's a side comment. We are told that Maria Reynolds came to Hamilton out of desperation because her husband has cheated on her, abused her, and abandoned her. So Hamilton gives her some money, walks her home, and then wanted to sleep with her, or she wanted to sleep with him. The facts of this situation that we can pull out are that Maria Reynolds was very vulnerable, went to Hamilton for help, and they had an affair. The reason I want to pull these out, even though that's kind of how it was portrayed in the song already, is that there are different... We can know the facts, but we're not necessarily told the motivations or who initiated what or who chose what or what people's intentions were. That's something that Hamilton tries to put on this later, and maybe something that we could try to pull out from the song if we wanted to, or we're given the impression through the song and the way that Jasmine Cephas Jones sings that this is something that Maria Reynolds wanted, but that's not necessarily a fact so much as the other aspects of it, that Reynolds was vulnerable, that her husband had abandoned her, that she was really in need of help and thought that she could go to Hamilton for help, and that he did offer to help her financially. I think it's important to note also in this time period that, well, really any time period actually, domestic violence was very difficult to navigate and escape because a woman couldn't divorce her husband without quite a bit of evidence of neglect and abuse to back her up. And even then, it's her word against her husband's to a group of men. However, all of that would play out. There wouldn't be any women in the court system necessarily that could sympathize or advocate or really understand her. And beyond that, life as a divorced woman was certain to be full of more perils because of all the things that women weren't allowed to do and all the spaces that women weren't allowed in this time period. So even if a woman had a reason to want a divorce and it was a bad enough situation that she actually might get it, there was no promise that her life would actually be any better or safer once she was divorced. So Maria Reynolds being abused and abandoned by her husband is a very serious situation. She is extremely vulnerable at this point. And then looking at her situation from that perspective, it's hard to see how a relationship between Hamilton and Reynolds could have been consensual, because he has so much more power than her, because he is a man, because he's an important man politically in early America, and because she's in this extremely vulnerable situation. I think there is a possibility here that he might have coerced her into sleeping with him in exchange for the help that she needed from him, that it was never her intention to have a relationship with him in the first place, possibly. And I recognize this is a pretty serious accusation and much different. It's completely opposite of the way that this story is portrayed in the song or in Hamilton's own words. But, it's also maybe possible that Maria Reynolds was lonely because her husband was cruel to her. That was a bad relationship, and she did want a relationship with Hamilton. She wanted this affair. But there's also a third possibility that Hamilton and his pamphlet suggests was Reynolds' motivation, and that one makes even less sense. So I kind of want to bring in all of the different possibilities for this, because I don't think the one that Hamilton puts forth as reality is necessarily the most likely or the most logical. But let us keep listening, see if we can find out.
That's when I began to pray, Lord, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. Oh my God, she looks so helpless, and her body's saying hell yes. No.
Ooh, sorry to cut in so abruptly, but that line about her looking helpless makes me shudder a little bit more than it used to, knowing how very true that is, how really, really vulnerable Maria Reynolds is. She is actually helpless in this situation.
Show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. In my mind, I'm trying to go. Then her mouth is on mine, and I don't say no, no, say no to this. 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 I wish I could say that was the last time I said that last time. It became a pastime. A month into this endeavor, I received a letter from a Mr. James Reynolds. Even better, it said.
Okay, so there are more facts here to note. It is helpful that while Hamilton is crafting his own narrative here for his own purposes and own benefit, we still do get some of the facts of the situation. And I think one of the facts that we can pull from this part is that Maria Reynolds and Hamilton had an ongoing relationship. So this wasn't just a one-time thing. We know that she was vulnerable, that she went to Hamilton for help, that they began having some kind of relationship, and that it was ongoing. So that indicates to me that maybe Maria Reynolds did consent to this relationship, that she wanted it and allowed it to happen more than once, but also she still has very little power in this relationship and this society. And so I don't know that we could even consider her able to consent. And it's still possible that Hamilton coerced her into this ongoing relationship for his ongoing help in the midst of her vulnerability. But anyway, all that to say, we don't really know what the truth of that is, but then James Reynolds finds out about this relationship and writes a letter to Hamilton, and it is portrayed in the song like this.
A month into this endeavor, I received a letter from a Mr. James Reynolds. Even better, it said,
Dear sir, I hope this letter finds you in good health and in a prosperous enough position to put wealth in the pockets of people like me, down on their luck. You see, that was my wife who you decided to. Uh-oh, you made the wrong sucker a cuckold, so time to pay the piper for the pants you unbuckle. And hey, you can keep seeing my whole wife if the price is right. If not, I'm telling you, your wife.
Okay, so things are getting crazy. James Reynolds finds out about this relationship and decides to extort Hamilton with the threat of making this affair public, which would probably, in this time period, ruin Hamilton's political career. Which is another crazy thing to think about. This would be it. He'd be done in politics forever. Think about all the different things that came out, even just in the 2016 election, that did not ruin certain politicians' political careers. But anyway, so I tried to find this actual letter that they're kind of referring to, and I think I had a hard time. There are quite a bit of letters. Lots of these papers, especially from just the founding fathers in general, are for free online, and I'll put a lot of links to the ones that I found and I'm using in my description. But if you are interested in researching this for yourself, it's actually pretty easy, which is awesome. And I think what Lin-Manuel Miranda did was kind of summarize and compact different letters from James Reynolds into these couple of lyrics that we're not spending years going back and forth. So it's a little bit confusing, but we'll go through this and hopefully I can make it make sense. I did find one letter from James Reynolds to Alexander Hamilton, dated December 15th, 1971. And I think this is one of the letters that these lyrics are based off of, but it's not the only one. I'll put the link in my description. It's really hard to read because spelling wasn't standardized then, and this site preserves the original writing, so I might struggle over some of the words a little bit. But it doesn't seem like in this letter also that Reynolds is encouraging the affair to continue as long as Hamilton keeps paying him. But here's the part of the letter where Reynolds describes confronting his wife about this relationship. James Reynolds says, "She fell upon her knees and asked forgiveness and discovered everything to me respecting the matter, and says that she was unhappy and not knowing what to do without some assistance. She called on you for the loan of some money, which you told her you would call on her the next evening, which accordingly you did. And there, sir, you took advantage of a poor, broken-hearted woman. Instead of being a friend, you have acted the part of the most cruelest man in existence. You have made a whole family miserable. She says that there is no other man that she cares for in this world. Now, sir, you have been the cause of cooling her affections for me. She was a woman. I would sacrifice almost my life to make her happy, but now I am determined to have satisfaction. It shan't be, or I shan't be. Oh, sorry. See, it's difficult. What does the word shan't even mean? It shan't be only one family that's miserable, for I am robbed of all happiness in this world. I am determined to leave her and take my daughter with me, that she shan't see her poor mother." Okay. There's a lot of interesting things there, I think, and I have evidence and information that I'll bring up for this later, but I'm pretty sure James Reynolds was actually pretty abusive towards Maria Reynolds, so I hesitate to agree with the way that he retells this story. But this is more similar to what I was saying earlier, that maybe Maria went to Hamilton for help and then Hamilton took advantage of her. Of course, the reason that she was vulnerable in the first place is because her husband was off doing whatever, so I don't think James Reynolds is at all innocent in this situation. This letter really, he seems to be blaming Hamilton for all of his unhappiness, for his wife not being affectionate towards him, and for his misery, when really he might have some of his own responsibility for those things. But anyway, let's go back to the song and see how Maria Reynolds is portrayed as responding to her husband's extortion. Again, the extortion isn't in this letter, but when we get to reading the actual Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton, he's very thorough. He provides all of the letters and quotes them and everything. And so from his pamphlet, we have some pieces of James Reynolds' other letters where he does decide to extort him. But in this first letter, I think this is one of the first ones, if I remember correctly, Reynolds is not extorting Hamilton. He just says, "I will have satisfaction," which is vague and dramatic. But anyway, let's get back to the song.
Hey, you can keep seeing my whole wife if the price is right. If not, I'm telling your wife.
I hit the letter and I raced to a place, screamed, "I'll cut you in the face." She said,
No, sir.
dressed apologetic, a mess. She looked pathetic, she cried.
Please don't go,
So
sir.
what's your full story? You said
I don't know about any letters.
stop crying, goddammit, get up.
I didn't know any better.
How you ruined me.
Please don't leave me
I
with
am
him
helpless. How could I do this?
Just give him what he wants and you can
I
have
don't
me.
want you.
Whatever
I
he
don't want
wants,
you.
if you
I
pay,
don't-
you can stay.
Okay, get it, Jasmine. Incredible. Okay. So now we're getting to this third possibility of what the story actually is that I referenced earlier but didn't get to yet. The one that Hamilton tries to convince people of. I don't know. I don't want to say this is the one that he believes because I don't know that he actually believes it. But this is what he states in the pamphlet on these events, is that he believes that this was a big conspiracy all along to get money from him. That Maria and James were working together in this and had planned to seduce him and then extort him. Yes, he honestly believes that. And even just like putting it out there like that, it doesn't feel very likely to me, but whatever. In the part of the song we just listened to, it looks like I have the lyrics like in my notes, so it's I think easier to read than listening to it to see this. But it looks like Maria Reynolds denies this extortion conspiracy at first by saying that she didn't know about a letter. She doesn't know what her husband is doing. But then she kind of seems to admit that she knew what her husband was up to when she says she didn't know any better, and that their relationship can continue if Hamilton pays her husband. So she doesn't, the character Maria Reynolds in the musical almost seems to admit to being part of this conspiracy, or maybe even not part of it, but like a prop in it, having knowledge of it if she is vulnerable and helpless. So because the musical version of Maria Reynolds isn't too clear one way or the other whether it is a conspiracy and Maria Reynolds was part of this and wanting to extort Hamilton, or if it was James Reynolds' plan all along to extort Hamilton and Maria was really helpless in this situation. It's because it's not clear. The musical kind of confirms the real-life Alexander Hamilton's claim that Maria and James were working together to take advantage of him, that he is the victim of this situation. So I wanted to read some of the Reynolds pamphlet to kind of get more into this and break apart and kind of pull apart what Hamilton's theories are to hear exactly what his claims are. And I think it's important, too, that, like, when we're watching the musical of Hamilton, we're watching these events play out on stage. We see Hamilton and Maria Reynolds interacting, and Hamilton deciding, like, oh, do I give in to this temptation, or do I not? Can I say no to this as the song goes on? But that portrayal is still based on the words in the Reynolds pamphlet. And so we're not necessarily seeing exactly what happened. We're seeing what Hamilton said later actually happened. And he might have other motivations for telling the truth or not telling the truth, or trying to play the victim and be part of this larger conspiracy, or say that there is this larger conspiracy, that such a conspiracy exists in the first place. So he has motivations to lie, is what I'm trying to nicely say. So let's look at some of the Reynolds pamphlet, published in July 1797, and hear exactly what Hamilton's claims are. Okay. The charge against me is a connection with one James Reynolds for purposes of improper oh gosh. Hamilton is a lawyer. He uses big words. Pecuniary? Improper speculation. I'm just going to skip it. It'll be fine. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife. Oh, wait. Actually, this is a song. Let me just have David Diggs sing this to you.
The Reynolds Pamphlet. Have you read this? Alexander Hamilton had a torrid affair, and he wrote it down right there. Highlights! The charge against me is a connection with one James Reynolds for purposes of improper speculation. My real crime is an amorous connection with his wife for a considerable time with his knowing consent. Damn! I had frequent meetings with her. Most of them in my own house. At his own house. At his own house. Damn. Mrs. Hamilton.
Okay. So most of that first part was in what I wanted to look at, and then Hamilton in the real Hamilton in the Reynolds pamphlet also adds, as to Mrs. Reynolds, if she was not an accomplice, it is too probable she was. Her situation would naturally subject her to the will of her husband, but enough besides will appeal in the sequel to show that her testimony merits no attention. So, it's sprinkling some misogyny there, I guess. So, Hamilton's conspiracy is that both of the Reynolds were working together all along to get money from him. Or at the very least, Maria Reynolds was just doing whatever her husband told her. And if neither of those, then the testimony doesn't matter anyway. So, a little misogyny cameo. I don't think this possibility makes sense or is very likely true. The story started with Maria Reynolds in a very vulnerable situation because of her husband. And that's not my interpretation or Hamilton's. That's just like a fact. Her husband was not providing for her. He was not around. She doesn't really have any agency in this time period. And her husband was likely cheating on her, possibly was going to leave her. Mentions in his letter to Hamilton that he was going to leave her. Weird things. So Maria Reynolds was in need of help and money. And yeah, for whatever reason, she sought out Hamilton for that help. I find it very unlikely that the Reynolds would commit to this extortion plan or conspiracy to the extent of James actually abusing his wife, leaving town, and leaving her in a genuinely desperate situation. And knowing that, spoiler alert, Maria is able to actually get a divorce from James sometime after this. That means there probably was significant evidence of his neglect. So it doesn't make sense to me that a man neglecting and abusing his wife would also plan with her to extort Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton tells the story in this way in the Reynolds pamphlet. And unfortunately, this all is not wrapped by David Diggs, and so I'm just going to have to read it. I apologize. I wish I could. Wouldn't that be amazing if I could somehow get him as a guest on my podcast to just freestyle with my primary sources? Incredible. Somebody reach out to David Diggs. Anyway, sometime in the summer of 1791, a woman called at my house in the city of Philadelphia and asked to speak with me in private. I attended her into a room apart from the family. With a seeming air of affliction, she informed that she was the daughter of a Mr. Lewis, sister to a Mr. G. Livingston of the state of New York, and wife to a Mr. Reynolds, whose father was in the commissary department during the war with Great Britain. That her husband, who for a long time had treated her very cruelly, had lately left left her to live with another woman, and in so destitute a condition that, though desirous of returning to her friends, she had not the means, that knowing I was a citizen of New York, she had taken the liberty to apply to my humanity for assistance. Is that one sentence? Oh, it's like 3 sentences. Okay. I love looking at primary sources, but not when they write forever. Anyway, sorry, continuing. I replied that her situation was a very interesting one, that I was disposed to afford her assistance to convey her to her friends, but this at the moment not being convenient to me, which was the fact, that I must request the place of her residence, to which I should bring or send a small supply of money. She told me the street and number of the house where she lodged. In the evening, I put a bank bill in my pocket and went to the house. I inquired for Mrs. Reynolds and was shown upstairs, at the head of which she met me and conducted me into a bedroom. I took the bill out of my pocket and gave it to her. Some conversation ensued, from which it was quickly apparent that other consolation would be acceptable. After this, I had frequent meetings with her, most of them at my own house, Mrs. Hamilton with her children being absent on a visit to her father. In the course of a short time, she mentioned to me that her husband had solicited a reconciliation and affected to consult me about it. I advised to it and was soon after informed by her that it had taken place. She told me besides that her husband had been engaged in speculation, and she believed she could give information respecting the conduct of some persons in the department which would be useful. I sent for Reynolds, who came to me accordingly. Okay, so this is really interesting. Hamilton is a very prolific writer, and he's very specific and intentional about the words that he uses. And I think we can see that already from how he's phrased things in the Reynolds pamphlet, how he's already kind of backing up his case by using words she appeared, she assumed, with a seeming air of affliction. You know, he's already setting up Maria Reynolds to be questionable, even while describing her vulnerable situation. So I think he's very intentional. It's important to know the motivations of him writing this. He's not just telling like a fun little story. This isn't like Secret Confessions from Alexander Hamilton. This is his defense against the charge of speculation, which he shifts over to James Reynolds, and interestingly, kind of uses him as a scapegoat, him and Maria Reynolds. So in reading over this, I think it's particularly interesting in how he cuts away from his one-on-one conversations and interactions with Maria. We don't get Maria's side of the story, and we don't have any other witnesses, so we can't say what Hamilton's description of this is true or false. We don't get a reason for why she didn't use the money he gave her to get to her friends and instead stayed and had a relationship with him. That's not answered. And the facts of this part of the story just don't make it seem like a big planned conspiracy, which is supposed to be what Hamilton is kind of arguing. So this is just a messy, like, human relationships that Hamilton got caught up in and decided to declare to the world. This beginning part of this, like, looking at the actions of Maria Reynolds and James Reynolds, like, it doesn't seem calculated. Why would they reconcile if the whole plan was to extort Hamilton in the first place? And why would Maria Reynolds go to him in the first place and say that she wants to leave town and needs his help leaving town? Like, if the plan was to extort him, wouldn't she just be like, I need help staying here? Like, just those details, I think, poke holes in Hamilton's idea. But anyway, continuing to read, he says, the intercourse with Mrs. Reynolds in the meantime continued, and though various reflections in which further knowledge of Reynolds' character and the suspicion of some concert between the husband and wife bore part, induced me to wish a cessation of it, yet her conduct made it extremely difficult to disentangle myself. All appearances of violent attachment and of agonizing distress at the idea of a relinquishment were played off with most imposing art. This, though it did not make me entirely dupe of the plot, yet kept me in a state of irresolution. My sensibility, perhaps my vanity, admitted the possibility of a real fondness and led me to adopt the plan of a gradual discontinuance rather than of sudden interruption, at least calculated to give pain, if real partiality existed. Mrs. Reynolds, on the other hand, employed every effort to keep up my attention and visits. Her pen was freely employed, and her letters were filled with those tender and pathetic effusions which would have been natural to a woman truly fond and neglected. So, the way that Hamilton characterizes Maria Reynolds here is just kind of illogical to me. It's clear, like I said before, that this pamphlet is not for the purpose of telling a story or confessing his mistakes or anything like that, but very much portraying himself as a victim in this situation and clearing his name from what he saw to be larger crimes. He claims that Reynolds appeared to be genuinely attached and fond of him, that she was distressed at the idea of ending their relationship, and that the way she wrote made her seem truly fond of him and neglected by her husband. You can see how he's creating this narrative very carefully with all of the words that he chooses, all of those descriptive words of Maria. And I think it more likely and makes more sense that Maria Reynolds was actually feeling these things than pretending to feel these things for the sake of duping and extorting Hamilton. It's just too much of a complicated conspiracy, and those feelings are too logical for a woman in her situation. I said at the beginning, I found it very unlikely that this relationship was consensual or that Maria Reynolds actually liked him. But maybe that's due to my own dislike of Alexander Hamilton. But reading this part of the pamphlet, I actually have another theory. So we know Maria Reynolds is abandoned by her husband. She wants to leave New York, but needs money to do it. So she seeks out Hamilton and asks him for a loan. Her original plan is to leave with her daughter to find friends that will support them. But then we know that she ends up having this ongoing relationship with Hamilton. So, like, what changed? Maybe she initiated a relationship with him, like Hamilton suggests, but because there are much harsher consequences for women than for men for these kinds of things, I find it more likely that Hamilton initiated this. I could be wrong. I could definitely be wrong, but this is what I think might be possible. Maybe he initiated this as like a direct connection to the favor that he was doing for her, or maybe he wasn't so explicit about it, but she just felt powerless and obligated to comply because she was so vulnerable. However, once it was initiated, it did continue, and Hamilton seems to imply that Maria Reynolds was attached to him, which I actually believe based on the way that he wrote it, like he was trying to play it off as if it was a lie, but couldn't deny the fact that she did seem attached to him because they did have all the letters, so that was kind of like, there's that evidence. And so that and the evidence that they continued meeting, it seems like she actually did like him. I guess somebody does, but whatever. Though he tries to imply that she was just lying to him, I already don't believe that in a larger conspiracy, so I have to include that she was actually attached to him in some way. It almost seems like a Stockholm Syndrome type of situation, just another like toxic, abusive relationship from Maria Reynolds, which makes me feel sad for her. But it might not even be an entirely romantic connection for her. Like, she's just coming off of an abusive relationship where her husband has abandoned her. So however Hamilton treats her, even if he is actually taking advantage of her vulnerability and coercing her and doing her favors in return for this relationship, it honestly might still be better than the way that her husband treats her. So let's move on to the part of the pamphlet where James Reynolds finds out, or pretends to find out, according to Hamilton and his conspiracy. Anyway, he says, "One day I received a letter from her, which is in the appendix, intimating a discovery by her husband. It was a matter of doubt with me whether there had really been a discovery by accident or whether the time for the catastrophe of the plot was arrived. The same day, being the 15th of December, 1971, I received from Mr. Reynolds the letter by which he informs me of the detection of his wife in the act of writing a letter to me, and that he had obtained from her a discovery of her connection with me, suggesting that it was the consequence of an undue advantage taken of her distress. In answer to this, I sent him a note or message desiring him to call upon me at my office, which I think he did the same day. He, in substance, repeated the topics contained in his letter and concluded, as he had done there, that he was resolved to have satisfaction. I replied that he knew best what evidence he had of the alleged connection between me and his wife, that I neither admitted nor denied it, that if he knew of any injury I had done him, entitling him to satisfaction, it lay with him to name it. He traveled over the same ground as before, and again concluded with the same vague claim of satisfaction, but without specifying the kind which would content him. It was easy to understand that he wanted money, and to prevent an explosion I resolved to gratify him. But willing to manage his delicacy, if he had any, I reminded him that I had, at our first interview, made him a promise of service, that I was disposed to do it as far as might be proper and in my power, and requested him to consider in what manner I could do it, and write to me. He withdrew with a promise of compliance. 2 days after, the 17th of December, he wrote to me the letter, and again, he gives a reference in the appendix. The evident drift of this letter is to exaggerate the injury done by me, and to make a display of sensibility, and to magnify the atonement which was to be required. It, however, comes to no conclusion, but proposes a meeting at the George Tavern, or some other place more agreeable to me, which I should name. On receipt of this letter, I called upon Reynolds, and, assuming a decisive tone, told him that I was tired of his indecision, and insisted upon his declaring to me explicitly what he was aimed at. He again promised to explain by letter. On the 19th, I received the promised letter, by the essence of which that he was willing to take $1,000 as the plaster of his wounded honor. On the 17th of January, I received another letter by which Reynolds invites me to renew my visits to his wife. He had before requested that I would see her no more. If I recollect rightly, I did not immediately accept the invitation, nor till after I had received several letters from Mrs. Reynolds. Okay, so just to kind of summarize and analyze, because there's a lot going on here, and Hamilton writes in very long sentences. James Reynolds is mad that Hamilton is sleeping with his wife and tells Hamilton multiple times that he wants satisfaction. Hamilton even criticizes him in this pamphlet on being so vague, which I think really undermines Hamilton's claim that this was all a big conspiracy with the intent to extort him from the very beginning. If the Reynolds were planning to extort him the whole time, wouldn't James Reynolds have opened with, "Hello, give me money," instead of just, "I demand satisfaction for you ruining my happiness," or whatever? And also, if it was the plan all along to extort Hamilton and continue to extort him, why would James Reynolds first tell Hamilton never to see his wife again and then change his mind and go back? To me, James Reynolds comes across as a person who is in a bad relationship, an unhappy marriage, likely because of his own decisions and abuse of his wife, and in the midst of making a mess of things, he finds an opportunity to use this situation to his monetary advantage. I don't think he has any kind of master plan. I think he was an opportunist. I also think it's important to mention the context of all this, that behind the scenes of James Reynolds selling his wife, basically, and extorting Hamilton is the existence and the preservation of the institution of slavery. The idea of selling people, as James Reynolds is basically selling his wife to Hamilton, is pretty common in this time period and is already ideologically defended. So I don't think it's totally out there for him to come up with this idea. I don't think it's a conspiracy, but I don't think this idea would be far off. Of course, this is all evil. This is human trafficking, and it's abhorrent. And I think it's important to recognize that however bad Maria Reynolds' situation was, as a white woman, she was still a lot better off than any enslaved person in America at this time. The last part of the Reynolds pamphlet I wanted to read, I think, further confirms my theory that James Reynolds was just taking advantage of a situation he had created. Hamilton writes, "Mrs. Reynolds more than once communicated to me that Reynolds would occasionally relapse into discontent to his situation, would treat her very ill, hint at the assassination of me, and more openly threaten by way of revenge to inform Mrs. Hamilton. All of this naturally gave some uneasiness. I could not be absolutely certain whether it was an artifice or reality. In the workings of human inconsistency, it was very possible that the same man might be corrupt enough to compound for his wife's chastity, and yet have the sensibility enough to be restless in this situation and to hate the cause of it." So does James Reynolds seem at all like the kind of person who would conspire this elaborate plan to extort Hamilton? The fact that Hamilton claims he can't be certain if what Maria Reynolds was communicating to him was real or not seems like a reach to me. Like, maybe the assassination threat seems a little far-fetched, but I do find it more likely that he would continue to abuse his wife, that he would threaten to tell Eliza Hamilton, that he could be both prostituting his wife and mad that she was sleeping with someone else. That all seems consistent with his character, in a weird, inconsistent sort of way. He abandoned his wife in the first place and didn't seem to take responsibility for that when he wrote all mad about Hamilton allegedly taking advantage of her when she went to him for help. James Reynolds could have prevented all that in the first place by not being a sucky person, but, he created this mess and he wanted to get a paycheck from it, I guess. So I wanted to move on from this and talk a little bit more about the rest of Maria Reynolds' life, but some of my final thoughts on the song and the portrayal of Maria Reynolds in the musical Hamilton. I think it's so cliche to portray all of this as Hamilton falling prey to temptation and the woman being a kind of seductress, and it's just such a typical misogynistic thing to do, is to blame women for men's failures, and it's so much of a character that Hamilton has created. And I think seeing Maria Reynolds as that character in the musical rather than as a real person with real motivations and fears and all of that is really what solidified my suspicion about this whole situation. Also, Hamilton has the motivation to lie about this to avoid a potential financial scandal, which I think he believed, and maybe this is true, but that would be more disastrous for his career rather than the sex scandal. So I think Hamilton's motivations and fear about what these different situations could do to him are dramatized really well in the musical, even though the musical still passes off Hamilton's story as the truth. The opening of the song We Know characterizes this really well, where Hamilton is confronted by his enemies and accused of speculation. So let me pull that up.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Madison, Senator Burr. What is this?
We have the check stubs from separate accounts. Almost $1,000 paid in different amounts to a Mr. James Reynolds way back in 1791.
Is that what you have? Are you done?
You are uniquely situated by virtue of your position.
Though virtue is not a word I'd apply to this situation.
To seek financial gain, to stray from your sacred mission.
And the evidence suggests you engaged in speculation.
An immigrant embezzling our government funds.
I can almost see the headline, your career is done.
I hope you save some money for your daughter and sons.
You best one run back where you come from.
Ha! You don't even know what you're asking me to confess.
Confess.
You have nothing, I don't have to tell you anything at all. Unless if I can prove that I never broke the law, do you promise not to tell another soul what you saw?
No one else was in the room where it happened.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
So you can see a little bit more from that portrayal of it, what Hamilton was up against, that what he had to find a way to wiggle out of. Even though the Reynolds pamphlet was America's first sex scandal, perhaps Hamilton thought that it would be convincing enough to get him out of what was a more scandalous situation, a more illegal situation, an actual illegal situation, whatever shady financial stuff that he was doing on the side. So it's possible, I don't know, I want to put the theory out there that it's possible that maybe the Reynolds pamphlet was invented or exaggerated or put out there to be, even if it is real, put out there with the purpose of being a distraction from whatever else Hamilton was up to. I don't think an actually innocent person would have put together the Reynolds pamphlet and published it. I really think there's something else shady going on there that Hamilton actually did, that he was using the Reynolds pamphlet to distract from or to pull attention from. But I don't know. I'm not a very professional historian. I don't have all the facts. I just have my suspicions. So if you are more than welcome to disagree with me. If you were like a diehard Hamilton fan, that's totally fine. But let's move on from this and talk a little bit more about Maria Reynolds and the rest of her life. So Maria Reynolds was the wife of James Reynolds and was Alexander Hamilton's mistress between 1791 and 1792. She became the object of much scrutiny after the release of the Reynolds pamphlet and central in America's first political sex scandal. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is from Wikipedia. I always use Wikipedia to give us a general overview of things, so I guess that's why I forgot to say it. But this will be linked in my description as well. Anyway, on July 28th, 1783, when she was 15, Maria Lewis married James Reynolds. Reynolds had served in the Revolutionary War in the commissary department and was older than Maria by at least several years. After the war, he tried frequently to claim damages and get reimbursed for them by the government. Maria had one child with Reynolds, a daughter named Susan, born August 18th, 1785, later baptized in October. At some point before 1791, James Reynolds moved with Maria and their daughter from New York to Philadelphia. It was there in the summer of 1791 that 23-year-old Maria visited 34-year-old Hamilton at his Philadelphia residence and asked for help, claiming her abusive husband had abandoned her. Due to Hamilton's political office, he could very easily help her move back to New York City. Hamilton organized a meeting for later that evening to give Maria the money. Once Hamilton arrived at the boarding house where Maria was lodging, she brought him upstairs and led him into her bedroom, where he recounts what we read in the Reynolds pamphlet. So thus was the beginning of the infamous Reynolds affair. In November 1792, James Reynolds, after illegally purchasing Revolutionary War soldiers' pensions and payback claims, was imprisoned for forgery with Virginian Jacob Clingman, his partner in crime. Reynolds wrote to Hamilton, who refused to help, and likewise rejected Maria's letters and requests for further money. Clingman then informed Hamilton's Democratic-Republican rivals that Reynolds had information against the Treasury Secretary. James Monroe, Frederick Muhlenberg, and Abraham Venable visited Reynolds in jail, where Reynolds hinted at some unspecified public misconduct on Hamilton's part, whose details he promised to expose after coming out of prison, only to disappear immediately after his release on December 12, 1792. The congressman also personally interviewed Maria, who corroborated her husband's accusations of speculation against Hamilton by producing the notes in Hamilton's disguised hand that had accompanied his payments to Reynolds. On December 15, 1972, Monroe, Venable, and Muhlenberg went to Hamilton with the evidence that they had gathered and confronted him on the possible charge of speculation. I think that's what we just listened to in the musical, though there are different characters present in that scene, just probably because Monroe, Venable, and Muhlenberg weren't in the rest of the musical. Back to the Wikipedia article. Fearful of what a scandal could do to his career, Hamilton admitted to the affair with Maria, or claimed that he had an affair with Maria, proved with letters from both Maria and James Reynolds that his payments to Reynolds related to the blackmail over his adultery and not to Treasury misconduct, and asked them to keep the information private, as he was innocent of any public wrongdoing. They agreed, although Monroe created copies of the letters and sent them to Thomas Jefferson. John Beckley also created copies of the correspondence. Clingman, on January 1, 1973, declared to Monroe that Maria claimed that the affair had been invented as a cover for a speculation scheme. However, the letter from Colonel Jeremiah Wadsworth to Hamilton, dated August 2, 1797, relates how during Reynolds' detention in November through December of 1792, Maria had applied to both Wadsworth and Governor General Thomas Mifflin in the attempt to convince them to help her obtain her husband's release from prison. Maria spontaneously told both of them the story of her first acquaintance and following relationship with Hamilton in words that match Hamilton's description of their first encounter as reported in both the first draft of the Reynolds pamphlet and the printed version, as well as James Reynolds' first letter to Hamilton. Historian Tilar J. Mazzeo has advanced a theory that the affair never happened. This is what I'm saying. This is what I think. Okay, outside of the Reynolds pamphlet, there is no evidence that the affair occurred. Others connected with the scandal, from James Monroe, who held the papers relating to James Reynolds, to Maria Reynolds herself, said that it was a cover-up for a financial scandal. Hamilton never produced the manuscript copies of Maria's letters, though the newspapers and Maria both suggested obtaining a handwriting sample. Hamilton said that they had been placed with a friend of his who claimed that he had never seen them, suggesting that the letters could have been forged. The newspaper writers also pointed out that Maria's letters correctly spell long, complex words and yet sometimes misspelled simple words in a way that make no phonetic sense. As Thomas Jefferson biographer Julian P. Boyd stated, the letters could resemble what an educated man believed an uneducated woman's love letters to look like. This misogyny is always going to come bite you in the butt. Okay, anyway, in 1793, Maria enlisted the aid of Aaron Burr. Believe it or not, Aaron Burr successfully helped her get a divorce from James Reynolds. Before obtaining the divorce, she had gone to live with Virginia and Jacob Clingman, whom she later married in 1795, and the one who had been the partner in crime of Reynolds' speculations, and had been arrested with him in November 1792. She took up residence in Alexandria, Virginia. After the pamphlet was released in 1797, Maria was publicly scorned, and she and her second husband decided to move to Britain. After having returned to Philadelphia without Clingman some years later, she went by the name of Maria Clement. No record of her divorce from Clingman has been found. Soon thereafter, she became the housekeeper of a Dr. Matthew. A merchant by the name of Peter Grotian, maybe? It looks kind of German. I said that kind of German. Grotian? Something like that, in 1842 reported that he had met Maria many years earlier. She'd apparently told him that she had written a pamphlet of her own, giving her side of the story that Hamilton had told in his Reynolds pamphlet. If Maria's pamphlet existed, it was never published. In 1800, her daughter Susan was sent to a Boston boarding school with the help of Congressman William Eustis, who had been petitioned by Aaron Burr to help the girl. In 1806, Maria married Dr. Matthew, for whom she had worked as a housekeeper. In 1808, Susan Reynolds came to live with her mother and spent several years with her in Philadelphia. Described by her acquaintance Peter Grotian as highly amiable and handsome, Maria Reynolds, now Matthew, became highly respected with her marriage to the doctor. She became religious, joining the Methodist Church, and put her past behind her. She enjoyed the love and goodwill of all who knew her. Again, from Peter Grotian. She died on March 25th, 1828. So, where does this all leave us? This was a lot. I think that we don't really have enough information to say for sure the events of the Reynolds pamphlet really happened. I find Hamilton's version of the story unlikely and his word untrustworthy because he definitely had the motivation to lie, the writing ability and social standing to get away with it, and the audacity to throw a vulnerable woman under the bus to save his own skin. Honestly, I find it pretty likely that none of this happened, but I don't have the proof to say that for sure, so I think I will leave this open-ended. It's up to you then what possibility you think is the most likely and where the evidence leads you. That's the interesting thing about studying history is that even though stuff happened so long ago, we're always finding new evidence and looking at stories in new ways that lead us to new conclusions. So speaking of conclusions, that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for sleuthing with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will catch you guys on next Tuesday, where we'll talk more about other things. Or maybe it'll be a Tuesday after that, because life things are getting a bit crazy for me. in a good way. But I'm just trying to relocate and figure out a bunch of things, which is why there was no episode last week. I've been kind of busy, but I have been really, really enjoying this podcast, and so I will be back. Don't forget to follow History Sleuth wherever you get your podcast so you don't miss the next episode, whenever that might be, and rate and review when you can. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye!